What would you do if the very soil beneath your feet, your home, your dignity, were trampled by those who claim to rule you? If every sunrise reminded you not of hope, but of chains tightening around your people? Tonight, Patriot, I want you to listen closely, because this is the story of a woman who walked through humiliation, betrayal, and silent suffering, and still chose to stand for freedom. Eleanor Briggs, once dismissed as a poor farmer's daughter, mocked by English merchants, and ignored by officers drunk on their own power, arrived at a hidden training camp deep in the wilderness. No insignia, no escort, no announcement. Just the quiet resolve of someone who has seen enough cruelty to know that struggle is the only path left. While British generals feasted in their grand halls, Eleanor trudged through mud and cold, carrying nothing but the weight of her people's humiliation, and a secret she refused to surrender. The men at that camp didn't know what to make of her, a lone traveler in a land ruled by fear. But patriots recognize courage, even when it enters without a sound. Before we continue, Patriot, are you already subscribed? If not, join us, leave your like, and stand with this story. All right then, now we can begin. The first thing Eleanor felt when she entered the camp was not welcome. It was measuring, cold eyes scraping across her clothes, her hands, the way she walked, as if every step needed permission. The instructors did not bother to hide it. To them, she was just a thin farmer's girl with calloused fingers and a tired look, another soul crushed by English taxes who had wandered beyond her place. A fragile body in a world of gunpowder and steel, nothing more. One of them, a broad man with a scar along his jaw, nudged another with his elbow. "We training wives now," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Several men laughed under their breath. Not a joyful laugh. A laugh soaked in disbelief and scorn. Eleanor's cheeks burned, not from shyness, but from the sting of degradation. She kept her gaze forward. If she looked at them, they would see the storm behind her eyes. The camp itself was carved into the forest like a wound. Rough cabins, bare earth, the smell of sweat, gun oil, and old fear. Simple militia boys stepped aside when she passed, curiosity battling with embarrassment. They had seen disgrace before. Farmers whipped in front of their children for unpaid levies. Old men pushed from roads so English officers could ride through without slowing their horses. Women searched as if they were thieves, while red-coated soldiers smirked and rifled through their baskets. The land was soaked in contempt. Yet even they struggled to imagine a woman standing beside them with a musket in hand. "Name?" asked the chief instructor, a stern veteran with grey at his temples. His coat was patched, but his posture held the stiffness of old command. "Eleanor Briggs," she replied. He studied her, as one might study a broken plough. "You're late," he said, "and we are not a shelter for the lost. This is a place for sacrifice, not for those seeking sympathy." "I didn't come for pity," Eleanor answered. Her voice was steady, though she felt every eye on her like a blade. "I came for independence." A few men scoffed. The instructor's expression did not change, but something in his gaze hardened. "Liberty," he said slowly, "is not won with bold words from a farm girl. It is earned with blood. With choices you cannot take back, with bodies in the mud. Go to the line. We will see if you last an hour." They handed her a musket heavier than anything she had ever carried. Its wood was rough, splintering in her grip. She staggered for a heartbeat. That single moment was all they needed to confirm their judgment. She heard the whispers. "Too weak. She'll drop it before the first volley. Send her back to her fields." Each murmur a nail in the coffin they had already built for her. Drills began before the frost had fully lifted from the ground. Men marched, shouted, loaded, fired. Eleanor stumbled through the motions, arms trembling with strain. The recoil hammered her shoulder. The first shot nearly drove her to her knees. Laughter rippled behind her. thin and sharp as a knife. Shame crept up her neck, burning hotter with every breath. They saw only clumsiness and fatigue. None of them saw the night she had walked alone along the hedgerows, remembering the English officer who had thrown her brother to the ground for daring to speak of rights. None of them saw the empty chair at her family table, taken by a tax collector's cruelty. "Again!" the instructor barked. She gritted her teeth, loaded, fired. Smoke stung her eyes. The butt pounded bone. Her shoulder throbbed, her fingers numbed, but she did not let go. Each shot felt like a small rebellion against the contempt that had followed her since childhood, against the nobleman who rode past her father's farm without seeing him as a man, against the merchant who had cheated her mother and laughed in her face, against the soldiers who treated their people like animals to be herded and beaten. By midday her shirt clung to her skin, soaked in sweat. Her arms shook so violently she struggled to ram the charge down the barrel. The scarred instructor stepped in front of her, eyes cold. "Go home," he said. "You are a distraction. This is a place for men ready to die, not for illusions." Eleanor's breath came in rough gasps. "My home," she replied, "is already under enemy boots." She forced the ramrod down, knuckles white. "If I leave now, I betray everyone who cannot be here." The word betrayal hung between them. It was not theatrical, it was simple truth. To turn away would be to abandon the old man whose barn had been burned as an example, the children who watched English flags rise over their fields, the widows who buried husbands for daring to whisper the word freedom. Later, when the sun slid behind the trees and the first thin cold of evening crept in, she heard the instructors speaking near the fire. They spoke as if she were deaf, as if her presence were nothing but a mild annoyance. "She'll break," one said. "They all do, if they don't belong." "She doesn't even know what real war is," another replied. "We're not training stories for taverns, we're preparing for slaughter." The chief instructor remained silent for a long time. Finally, he murmured, "Let her stay. The world will send her away soon enough. No need for us to waste our breath." Their indifference cut deeper than open hostility. They would not even grant her the dignity of being taken seriously. She was an inconvenience, a shadow, clinging to the edge of their rebellion. That night, Eleanor lay awake on a rough bunk in a crowded cabin. Around her, other recruits snored, muttered, twisted in dreams haunted by battlefields they had not yet seen. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind scrape the walls. In the darkness, memories rose like ghosts, her father's hands shaking when he signed the paper that surrendered half their crops, her brother's face the day he was dragged away for questioning, the sneer of the English officer who told her she would never understand the affairs of real men. Each scene another wound, each wound another step in this journey from obedience to defiance. She had not come here by accident. She had chosen this path after a chain of decisions that could no longer be undone. There were things she carried that the instructors knew nothing about. Letters, names, roots, a hidden truth whispered by someone inside the enemy's own circle, a revelation that, if used well, could change more than the fate of one farm girl. It could reshape the very balance between masters and subjects. Eleanor turned on her side and wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the ache in her muscles, the bruises blooming beneath her skin. The pain felt almost comforting. It reminded her that she was still here, that disgrace had not crushed her yet. Outside, a lone lantern flickered near the watchpost, casting uncertain light over the camp. Somewhere beyond those trees, English officers slept in comfort, confident that colonial farmers would always bow their heads and obey. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs. This was more than training, more than punishment for daring to step out of her place. It was the beginning of a transformation that neither the instructors nor the red-coated lords could see coming. The camp might see a misplaced peasant, the empire might see a powerless woman, but the night knew better. In that silent darkness between doubt and resolve, something inside her settled with the weight of destiny, as if every insult, every shame, every forgotten plea for justice had been preparing her for the moment when her hidden purpose would finally be forced into the open. Night settled over the camp, like a heavy shroud, dimming every sound except the rustle of branches and the distant crack of frost breaking under the weight of winter. Eleanor moved through the training hut with tired steps, her breath forming small clouds in the air. The lanterns cast trembling halos on the walls, turning every shadow into a warning. She was exhausted, her muscles burned. Her shoulder still throbbed from the recoil of the musket, yet she stayed, practicing the motions the instructors had mocked earlier. She refused to give them another reason to spit contempt her way. She didn't hear the two men approach, only the sudden crunch of straw behind her, then a violent impact. A boot slammed into the back of her legs, sending her crashing onto the frozen floor. Cold pierced her skin like glass. Straw stuck to her cheek as she tried to breathe. Another hand fisted in her collar and yanked her up just enough for her knees to scrape the ground before throwing her down again. This is what real war feels like, one of the instructors growled. His voice was low, eager, almost excited. Not your fantasies of independence and justice. She tried to rise, but a hard kick drove the air from her lungs. Pain shot through her ribs. She tasted metal. The humiliation burned deeper than the blows. Not just because they hurt, but because they mirrored every insult her people had endured for years. Farmers struck for speaking too loudly, elders shoved aside in the streets, widows fined for imagined debts, while English nobles laughed over their wine cups. The second man crouched beside her, his breath reeking of ale. "What did you think you were?" he whispered. "A savior, a soldier. You're nothing but a frightened girl playing rebellion." He pushed her face into the straw. Her hands clawed instinctively, searching for leverage. The cold gnawed at her bones. "Get up!" the first instructor barked. "Prove you deserve to stand on the same ground as men who've sacrificed everything." Eleanor forced, her arms beneath her. They trembled, buckling once, then twice. The floor felt alive with discomfort, like it wanted to swallow her disgrace whole. She dragged herself upward, but the second instructor slammed his elbow into her shoulder, knocking her flat again. A sharp cry escaped her. Rage flickered beneath it, thin but relentless. They circled her like predators, making their demonstration as public as they intended it to be cruel. This was punishment for daring to enter their world, for daring to seek dignity among them, for daring to challenge the boundaries they guarded so jealously. "Stand," the first man repeated, "or go back to your mother's fields and wait for the English to crush your family like they crushed the rest." Something inside her snapped, not in despair, but in defiance. She heard her brother's laughter before he disappeared forever. She saw her father's trembling hands signing away their harvest under the watchful gaze of an English officer who treated them as insects. She felt the weight of the hidden truth she carried, the revelation that had pushed her into this journey of rebellion. She could not afford to crawl. Her fingers dug into the straw. Her breath shook, but she pushed, slowly, painfully, inch by inch. Her legs trembled, threatening to collapse under her. The instructors watched with cold amusement, expecting her to fall again. But she rose, barely upright, swaying, bruised and gasping. A thin line of blood slid from her lip. Her hair hung, loose, half covering her face. Yet her eyes, those they could not bend, held a flame their cruelty failed to extinguish. The larger instructor took a step closer, expression tightening. "You should have stayed in the fields," he hissed. "That's where peasants like you belong." Eleanor's voice came raw but unwavering. "My people belong wherever liberty is defended." She fought for breath. "And so do I." A flicker crossed the chief instructor's face. Not sympathy, not respect, but recognition. Something in him understood that whatever they tried to break tonight would not snap easily. Before anyone spoke again, the door to the training hut creaked open. A gust of cold wind swept inside, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and distant smoke. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, silent, watchful, someone who had heard more than intended, someone whose presence would shift the path of the night. The instructors stiffened, shoulders tense, expressions darkening as the figure stepped forward, and the fragile balance inside that hut began to tilt toward consequences none of them were prepared to face. The figure in the doorway stepped into the lantern light. It was the chief instructor. The grey at his temples looked almost silver in the dim glow, his jaw set hard as stone. His gaze swept the scene in an instant. Eleanor bruised, unsteady on her feet, straw clinging to her clothes. The two men too close, too eager, breath still hot from violence. Silence pressed down for a heartbeat. Then one of them coughed, forcing a chuckle up from his chest, as if this were all a small joke gone slightly too far. The sound was muffled, nervous, laced with conceit. "We were just giving her a lesson," the scarred instructor said, straightening his shoulders. "She needs to learn the hard way if she's going to stand where real sacrifice is made." He lifted his chin, reaching for authority he didn't own. "War doesn't spare fragile souls. If she can't handle a demonstration, how will she handle the enemy?" The other man nodded quickly, almost tripping over his own arrogance. "She wants equality? She wants to call herself a patriot? Then she should feel what the English do to us. Disgrace, pain, degradation. We're doing her a favor, preparing her. She needed to understand that rebellion isn't a story told by a warm hearth." They spoke about her as if she were an object, a tool, a body instead of a person. Eleanor remained standing, breath ragged, ribs aching each time her lungs tried to pull in air. She watched the chief instructor's expression, searching for any sign of outrage, of justice. For a moment his eyes met hers, and she saw something there, not tenderness, not compassion, but the harsh recognition of someone who had seen too much brutality to be easily shocked. He looked at the two men again. "This is how you teach," he said quietly. The hut seemed to lean closer to catch his words. "You beat a woman into the earth and call it training. You hide behind talk of hardship while you enjoy the taste of power. You think that makes you better than the officers who spit on our farmers?" The scarred man's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, the British don't spare us because we're poor or because we cry about dignity. They shame us. They insult our fathers. They drag old men from their homes. If she stays, she'll see worse than this. At least here she learns under our banner, not under the enemy's flag." A low laugh slipped from his throat, barely, contained, ugly in its pride. "Besides," he added, "she's just a peasant girl. Better she breaks here than out there, where her panic will get others killed." Those words dug under Eleanor's skin like hooks. Just a peasant girl. The same sentence she had heard in different mouths on different days, always used to justify some new injury. Just a farmer's daughter when a tax collector snatched the last of their grain. Just a colonist when a rich merchant refused them fair payment. Just a subject when an English noble reminded them that their lives existed for his comfort. The chief instructor stepped closer, boots grinding the straw. He stopped in front of Eleanor, his face inches from hers. She smelled wood smoke and cold air on him. "Can you stand on your own?" he asked. "I am," she answered, though her legs trembled. He nodded once, then turned slightly toward the two men. "You say she must learn like a soldier?" His voice darkened. "Then treat her like one. Strike her again like this. And you answer to me. Our fight is for independence, not for the pleasure of repeating our enemy's cruelty." They shifted uncomfortably, but pride would not let them bend easily. "We didn't know you were watching," the second instructor muttered. You thought no one would question you," the chief cut in. "You thought your little show of domination would disappear into the night like every insult our people have swallowed. This camp is not an English garrison. We do not crush. Our own to feel strong." Eleanor almost laughed at the bitter irony. They had already crushed her into the floor. They had already turned her body into an example. But something in the chief's rebuke cracked the smugness that had coated their words. The muffled laughter died. What remained was a dull, smouldering resentment. The scarred man flicked a glance at her, eyes burning with wounded vanity. She still needed the lesson, he insisted, softer now, stubborn. She needed to understand the cost of this path. If she stays, she will face worse than shame. There will be betrayal, decisions that send boys to their graves. She must learn that blood is the only ink that writes liberty. Eleanor spoke before the chief could. Her voice shook, but not from fear, from fury held on a tight leash. "I already know the cost," she said. "I saw it the day English soldiers dragged my brother from our yard, because he dared speak of rights. I heard it in the silence at our table afterward, when my father stared at his empty chair. You think this is my first lesson in disgrace, in contempt?" She lifted her chin. "You are late." The hut fell silent again. Her words hung between them like a blade. The chief instructor's gaze sharpened. There was more he wanted to ask, but he held back. Questions about where she came from, what had led her here, what flame burned behind those tired eyes. For now, he only jerked his head toward the door. "Enough for tonight," he ordered. "Return to your quarters, all of you." The two men obeyed, though their shoulders radiated frustration. As they passed Eleanor, one of them leaned close enough for her to feel his breath against her ear. "You will thank us," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "When the enemy comes, you'll remember who first showed you the ground." She did not answer. She simply watched them go, storing their faces in her memory beside those of other tormentors. Different uniforms, same hunger for control, same delight in someone else's suffering. Outside, the cold welcomed her with brutal honesty. The sky stretched overhead, heavy and dark, as if the stars themselves hesitated to look down on this land of abused farmers and arrogant officers. Across the campfires, she saw tired militia boys huddled together, their hands wrapped around tin cups, their eyes reflecting the weight of a struggle they barely understood. Men who had traded plows for muskets, who now marched for a liberty they had never tasted. Women moved between cabins, carrying blankets, tending to the wounded, holding children who had already seen more fear than they deserved. Eleanor's body ached with every step. Yet somewhere behind the pain, a quiet transformation was taking shape. The degradation she had just endured did not break her resolve. It sharpened it. It stripped away illusions about this place, about these men, about the rebellion itself. Not every patriot was pure, not every comrade noble. Some had brought the poison of the empire into their own hearts, copying the cruelty that had once ground them into the dust. She understood now that this journey would demand more than strength. It would require choices that cut deep, revelations that would wound, sacrifices that left scars no one else could see. And within her, the hidden truth she carried, names, roots, the secret betrayal festering in the ranks of English command, pressed harder against her chest, urging her to decide when and how to reveal it. As she approached her cabin, the murmur of voices faded. The camp was sinking into restless sleep. Eleanor paused at the threshold, one hand on the rough wood, her breath ghosting in the night air. She was still just a peasant girl in their eyes, a fragile body out of place. They did not know who she had met in the shadows of market alleys. They did not know which English noble had whispered too much after too much wine, unaware that his confessions would cross the line between master and subject. They had no idea that the woman they had thrown to the floor might soon hold in her hands a decision that could tilt the balance between a submissive colony and a land determined to rise. The cabin was almost dark when Eleanor stepped inside. Only a dying ember in the small stove glowed faintly, painting the walls in dull red. The other recruits were already stretched out on their rough bunks, wrapped in thin blankets, lost in uneasy sleep. Boots, coats, and worn hats lay scattered on the floor, carrying the dust of fields they might never see again. The smell of sweat, damp wool, and old smoke wrapped around her like another weight. She moved quietly, each step a reminder of bruises blooming beneath her clothes. Every breath hurt. A knife of pain slid between her ribs whenever she tried to straighten herself. She sat on the edge of her bunk and let her hands hang for a moment, fingers trembling, eyes burning with a tired fury. The night's disgrace replayed in her mind in brutal fragments. The boot, the fall, the straw against her face, the muffled laughter. The instructors had claimed they were teaching her, but there had been pleasure in their blows, the same twisted satisfaction she had seen in English officers when they humiliated farmers at the town square. Different flag, same poison. Around her, men shifted and muttered in their sleep. One whispered something about his children. Another flinched as if ducking an invisible musket shot. These were not heroes from songs. They were simple souls, plough-hands, cobblers, boys barely old enough to shave, dragged into a struggle against an empire that treated them as dirt. Somewhere in a distant manor, a noble rested on silk sheets, dreaming of profit and land, while peasants froze on hard boards. The contrast made her stomach twist. Eleanor drew a slow breath and reached for the worn bag she kept hidden beneath her blanket. Her fingers brushed the fabric, then found the small inner pocket sewn under the lining. The pain in her shoulder flared when she lifted the bag, but she did not stop. With careful movements, she slipped her hand inside and closed it around cold metal. The medallion was no bigger than a large coin, yet it felt heavier than any musket. She pulled it out and let it rest in her palm. In the dim light, the etched symbol caught a faint glimmer, the discreet mark of the Committee of Correspondence, not the official seal of any crown, not the crest of a wealthy merchant or English officer. A secret emblem that traveled from hand to hand, town to town, carrying messages no tyrant was meant to read. She traced the lines with her thumb, remembering the night it had been given to her. A back room behind a modest inn, the air thick with candle smoke and whispered plans. Men sat around a rough table, clergymen, tradesmen, one old lawyer with tired eyes but a steady voice. No one wore finery. No one needed it. Their power lay in ink and conviction, not in gold. They spoke of liberty not as a dream, but as an obligation. They spoke of sacrifice as a debt already owed by generations of farmers struck, widows cheated, children turned hungry by distant decrees. "You have walked among them," one had told her. "You've seen both sides. You know the contempt they hold for our people. You know how deep the rot of betrayal goes. We need someone like you." His hands had not shaken when he placed the medallion in hers. "You will not carry a title. They will call you girl, peasant, nuisance. Let them. It will keep you invisible, and you will listen." So she had listened, in markets where English officers mocked the accents of colonists, in taverns where merchants laughed about overcharging desperate farmers, in alleys where informers sold the names of patriots for a few coins and a promise of favor. She had carried letters tucked into her clothing, memorized routes of patrols, noted which mansions hosted secret meetings between greedy colonial elites and British officials, trading loyalty for privilege. Each journey wore away a bit more of her innocence, but strengthened something else, an iron sense of duty to those who could not defend themselves. Here, in this camp, she was still that messenger, still that spy in plain sight. Yet no one knew. To them she was a misplaced girl clinging to impossible dreams. The irony tasted bitter. The very men she had risked her life to help saw only weakness when they looked at her. They didn't realize that the hidden truth they needed might be locked behind the bruises on her ribs. Eleanor closed her fingers around the medallion. It pressed into her skin, a small, sharp reminder that her presence in this place was not an accident. The committee had sent her not just to train, but to observe, to decide whether this camp deserved to receive what she carried: knowledge of a planned crackdown, lists of collaborators, hints of a trap being laid by English command to lure key patriots into a false negotiation. If the wrong person learned of that information, the entire rebellion in this region could be shattered in one decisive strike. She lay back slowly, biting back a groan when her shoulder brushed the rough mattress. Above her, the wooden beams seemed to close in. Every creak sounded like a warning. She slid the medallion under her pillow, close enough to feel it near her ear, as if the metal itself whispered reminders of why she could not yield to degradation. Her thoughts drifted to home, to her father, bent over the fields that no longer belonged fully to him, to her mother's hands, red from scrubbing clothes for a merchant's family that barely acknowledged her presence, to the old woman down the lane, forced to sell her last cow to pay a tax she barely understood, while English officers rode past without a glance. None of them had coats lined with fur. None slept with bellies full. Their dignity was their last possession, and even that was under siege from an empire that believed they existed only to serve. This camp claimed to stand for those people, for every insulted farmer, every elder shoved aside in the street, every child taught to bow. Yet inside these walls, some men had already begun to mirror their enemies. They thought that pain alone shaped warriors. They thought that shaming someone proved strength. Eleanor knew better. Humiliation did not forge character. It revealed what was already there. She stared at the ceiling and let the ache course through her. The struggle was not just against red-coated soldiers or wealthy nobles. It was also against the cruelty that had seeped into hearts embittered by years of subjugation. If their uprising copied the empire's contempt, what kind of independence would they build? A new flag over the same degradation? That question gnawed at her as much as the bruises. It pulled her in two directions. One path: reveal the committee's trust, show the chief instructor the medallion, expose the hidden network behind her. She could earn immediate respect. She might even influence decisions, shape strategy, guide this place away from the arrogance she had just suffered. The other path: remain silent, watch longer, measure these men the way they had measured her. The wrong choice could hand a precious advantage to those unworthy of it, or worse, to someone ready to trade it for personal power. Outside, a dog barked faintly, answered by another deeper in the woods. The wind pushed against the walls with a low moan. Somewhere, a sentry coughed to stay awake. This was the world she had chosen, a world where every step, every word, every silence carried weight. Eleanor turned on her side, careful not to press her bruised ribs, and rested her hand flat beneath the thin pillow, feeling the outline of the medallion. The committee's emblem lay between her palm and the rough wood, like a small shield against despair. She knew that dawn would bring more drills, more skeptical glances, perhaps more veiled hostility from those who could not bear to see a woman refuse to bow. Yet it would also bring another chance, another day to measure these men, another opportunity to decide whether this camp was worthy of the secret she bore. Sleep did not come quickly. When it finally crept in, it carried with it fractured dreams of burning farms, red coats marching in perfect lines, and faceless colonists standing with empty hands raised toward a sky that never answered. Through it all, one image remained steady: her own hand, closing around the medallion, refusing to let it fall, even as the ground shook beneath her feet. By the time the first thin light of morning began to seep through the gaps in the wall, Eleanor's mind had settled on one grim certainty. The journey ahead would not be decided by strength of muscle alone. It would depend on choices that might never be understood by those around her, choices about trust, about when to speak and when to remain silent, about how far she was willing to go and what she was prepared to lose, to ensure that the rebellion did not devour its own soul before it could even taste liberty. Morning fell hard on the camp. No gentle dawn, no soft colors, just a pale, cold light, spilling over mud, smoke, and tired faces. Eleanor felt it on her skin like an order. Get up, move, continue. Her body protested with every motion, but she forced herself out of the bunk, washed quickly at the icy barrel, and pulled on her worn coat. The bruises along her ribs glowed beneath the fabric, each one a reminder of the previous night's degradation. They throbbed when she breathed. They throbbed when she thought. Men shuffled toward the drill yard in small groups. Some cast furtive glances at her, then looked away. They had heard enough to guess what had happened in the training hut. In places like this, shame travelled faster than fire. A few eyes held pity. Others held a quiet, guilty approval, as if part of them believed she had overstepped her place and received the punishment that always follows insolence. Poor farmers, cobblers, millers. Yet even they had absorbed the Empire's lesson. Some people were born to obey, and women most of all. Eleanor walked alone. The sky was the color of unpolished steel. Her breath came out in small clouds. Each step toward the hut felt like another decision carved into stone. She could turn away. She could disappear into the crowd, let the night fade into memory, let the insult stay buried. But that would mean accepting the same contempt she had watched all her life. It would mean agreeing that she was less, that her journey toward liberty had ended on a floor of dirty straw. She reached the door of the galpot and stopped for a heartbeat. Voices drifted from inside. Orders, jokes, the clatter of wood against wood as recruits practiced. The sound of struggle, the sound of men shaping themselves for revolt. She pushed the door open and stepped in. The two instructors were there, overseeing drills. The scarred one stood with arms crossed, his presence heavy, his gaze sharp. The other paced between the lines, correcting stances with impatient taps of a stick. Both looked up as the door creaked. Conversations faltered. A row of recruits paused mid-movement. Eleanor did not lower her eyes. She walked across the packed earth, feeling it hard beneath her boots, and stopped in front of them. The echo of last night's kicks still vibrated in her bones, but her voice came out clear. "If we're training," she said, "then let's train properly." The hut went silent. A few men exchanged glances. One swallowed hard, as if expecting another cruel demonstration. The scarred instructor's mouth twisted into a cold half-smile. "You're still here," he muttered. "Impressive. I thought you'd crawl back to your fields." She held his stare. "My fields are already under the enemy's heel. There's nowhere to crawl back to." The second instructor snorted. "You think a brave sentence changes anything? You were on the ground last night. You will be again." "Then let me earn it," Eleanor replied. "No ambush, no cheap lesson dressed up as honor. You say you're making soldiers. I'm here to become one. So stop pretending you're the enemy and start teaching like patriots." The word hit them with more force than any fist. Patriots. Men who claimed to stand for dignity. Men who shouted about freedom around campfires, then replayed the Empire's abuse inside their own walls. Several recruits shifted on their feet, discomfort visible on their faces. It was hard to hear a truth that cut so close. The scarred instructor stepped toward her until they were almost chest to chest. He was taller, broader, his shadow long in the dim light. "You want real instruction?" he asked, voice low. "You might not like what it requires." "I already don't like the alternative," she answered. He studied her for a long moment. Pride warred with something else in his eyes. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. Finally, he jerked his thumb toward the weapon rack. "Take a musket. We'll see if your courage can outlast your pain." She moved to the rack, fingers brushing over rough wood and cold iron. The bruises in her shoulder flared at the mere touch. She gritted her teeth and lifted the weapon anyway. It felt heavier than yesterday, as if the night had added stones to its stock. She returned to the center of the hut. The instructor began to bark commands. Load, aim, fire. Again, faster. She forced her hands to obey, fingers clumsy at first, then steadier as anger fueled her movements. Powder, ball, ram, prime, raise. Flame, smoke, recoil. The butt pounded her battered shoulder. The jolt tore through her ribs. Each shot burned through muscle and memory. Her brother's capture, her father's despair, the sneering English officer who had said colonists needed discipline, not rights. She missed the target more than she struck it. The pain blurred her vision. Sweat stung her healing cuts. Yet she did not ask to stop. She did not let the musket slip from her grasp. Each time her arms sagged, she dragged them back into position. Her body screamed. Her will dug in deeper. "Again," the instructor said, but the mocking edge was gone. His tone had turned flat, almost grudging. "You're dropping your elbow. Correct it." She adjusted. Fired. The shot tore a fresh hole closer to the center of the straw dummy. The other instructor watched in silence now, his earlier arrogance cooled by the sheer stubbornness before him. Around them, recruits resumed their drills, stealing glances at the woman who refused to break. For men accustomed to seeing mothers bow, wives obey, sisters remain silent, this sight planted a dangerous thought. Perhaps dignity had no single face. Perhaps revolt lived in more bodies than they had been taught to imagine. Time blurred into a punishing rhythm. Load, raise, fire. Her arms began to shake uncontrollably. The muscles in her neck spasmed. When her vision finally swam too much to aim, the scarred instructor stepped forward and lowered the barrel with one hand. "Enough," he said. She tried to protest, but the word died in a raw cough. Her chest felt as if it had been scraped from the inside. She swallowed back the taste of iron. His eyes roamed over her. Sweat-soaked hair, trembling hands, the sunlight catching the faint outline of bruises through her sleeve. "You're stubborn," he admitted. "Stupidity can look like bravery when it refuses to kneel. Or maybe you've forgotten what real sacrifice looks like," she rasped. "You chose this camp. Some of us had rebellion forced into our lives." At the far end of the hut, the chief instructor appeared, drawn by the noise. He took in the scene with a quick, sharp glance. Spent powder, Eleanor's shaking stance, the set of the other men's shoulders. Something in his expression changed, almost imperceptibly. "Who ordered this?" he asked. "I did," the scarred man replied. "She requested proper training." Eleanor met the chief's gaze. This was another crossroad, another chance to reveal the medallion, to pull the veil of secrecy from her identity as a courier of the committee. One word, one gesture, and everything would shift. They would see her differently. They might listen when she spoke of hidden plots and English schemes. They might also cage her under layers of hierarchy, strip away the anonymity that allowed her to move freely among peasants and soldiers alike. "I told them I'm not leaving," she said. "Instead, if our liberty is worth men vomiting blood on battlefields, then it is worth my bruises in a barn." A murmur rippled through the recruits. The chief held her eyes a moment longer, as if searching for something buried beneath the defiance. Secrets, motives. The hidden truth she carried pulsed against her skin, invisible behind layers of fabric and silence. He gave a short nod. "Very well," he said. "She stays, and from now on she trains under my orders. No more private lessons in darkness. If we are forging a force for independence, we will not model ourselves after the tyrants we claim to oppose." The scarred instructor's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. The other looked away, ashamed or resentful, perhaps both. Eleanor's legs threatened to fold under her. She steadied herself with the musket, drawing in slow, ragged breaths. The decision had been made. For now, she had carved out a place in this camp through endurance instead of rank, through resolve instead of titles. Yet she knew this was only the outer layer of the struggle. The harsher battle waited beneath, where information moved like shadows, and trust was a weapon as sharp as any bayonet. She stepped back from the firing line, shoulders screaming, lungs burning, the echo of shots still ringing in her ears. Around her, young men resumed their drills with renewed intensity, some stealing looks at her with something close to respect. The journey was changing them all in ways they barely understood. And as the sound of muskets thundered again inside the hut, Eleanor felt the weight of the medallion against her chest, hidden but insistent, reminding her that her next move would have to be chosen with even greater care, because soon the rebellion would demand more from her than pain. It would demand the dangerous revelations she had carried into this place from the moment she crossed its silent threshold. The drills resumed with the thunder of muskets and the hollow thud of boots against packed earth, but Eleanor no longer heard them as noise. They beat like a second heartbeat inside her skull, steady, relentless, a reminder that the rebellion did not pause for pain. She wiped the sweat from her brow and forced her trembling arms back into position. The chief instructor corrected a recruit's posture, barked an order, and for a moment his stern gaze swept across her, not dismissive, not mocking, measuring her with a new lens, and that alone stirred unease in the two men, who had broken her to the ground the night before. Their resentment simmered. It hid behind clenched jaws, behind stiff gestures, behind the false obedience of men who felt authority slipping from their fingers. The scarred instructor, leader of their little pack, watched her with an anger he tried to disguise as indifference. But contempt is a flame that cannot stay hidden long. It glows through cracks. He stepped toward her between drills, as if inspecting her stance. His voice was low, sharp as a blade kept under the table. "Don't think one morning earns you respect. You don't belong here. A single breath of real battle, and you'll run like a frightened child." Her hands tightened around the musket. "Then test me in the open," she said, tone quiet but steady. "Not in shadows, not with boots and cheap courage." His teeth clenched. Pride twisted through his features. Around them, a few recruits had turned subtly, pretending to keep training while keeping their ears open. Something dangerous hung in the air, thick, metallic, humming like the moment before lightning strikes. The chief instructor shouted an order from across the hut, turning his back for a heartbeat. That was all the scarred man needed. He lunged, perhaps wanting to shove her down again, perhaps wanting to break more than her dignity. His hand went for her collar, the same grip he had used last night when he slammed her into the floor. But Eleanor didn't fall this time. Her motion was lightning, silent, precise, born not from panic, but from the training learned in secret alleys, behind locked doors, in the coded shadows of the committee. Her palm snapped upward, striking the underside of his jaw with a force he never expected. His teeth clacked together. His head jerked back. The shock in his eyes was almost comical, brief, bewildered, before pain swallowed it whole. He staggered. She stepped in, twisted his wrist, and sent him crashing to his knees with a sharp cry that silenced half the hut. Gasps rippled. A musket clattered to the floor somewhere. Before he could recover, the other two instructors, his loyal shadows, sprang forward, faces twisted with outrage. One reached for her shoulder, the other reached for her waist, aiming to pin her. But Eleanor moved with the cold clarity of someone who had survived darker traps than this. She pivoted, catching the first man's forearm and driving her elbow into the soft spot beneath his ribs. He folded with a strangled grunt, collapsing. Sideways and knocking over a pile of wooden practice barrels. The second man tried to grab her from behind, but she dropped low, sweeping his leg with a clean, controlled strike. He crashed onto his back, the breath ripped from his lungs. 3 men lay groaning on the ground. The hut trembled with stunned silence. Eleanor breathed hard, the ache in her ribs flaring with every inhale, but her stance remained solid. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp. No trembling, no hesitation, just the quiet. Certainty of someone who had been forced to master survival long before she ever reached this camp. The scarred instructor tried to rise. His jaw hung at an odd angle. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. Hatred burned through his humiliation, turning his face blotchy with rage. "You—" he growled, voice distorted. "You dare—" "I warned you," Eleanor said. "If we train right." Recruits parted as the chief instructor rushed over, boots thudding, face carved from iron. His gaze darted from Eleanor to the three men sprawled across the dirt. The scene required no explanation. It spoke with the blunt honesty of shattered pride and exposed lies. "What happened here?" he demanded. No one answered at first. The recruits looked at one another, then at Eleanor, then at the men who had preyed on her in darkness and now lay beaten by daylight. Truth rippled through the hut without needing a single word. The chief read it in their faces, in the way the injured instructors avoided his eyes, in the way Eleanor stood, battered yet unbroken. He exhaled slowly, a long, cold breath that hinted at deeper consequences beginning to form. Eleanor did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply lowered the musket to her side and waited, not for praise, not for applause, but for the next inevitable shift in this journey she had chosen. A path lined not with glory, but with decisions that tasted like iron and obligation. A path where every action carried weight far beyond the walls of this hut. Outside, wind brushed against the boards, carrying faint echoes from distant farms, still trapped beneath English contempt. Those whispers seemed to seep through the cracks, reminding her that this rebellion demanded more than strength. It required judgment, caution, and soon the hidden truth she carried would have to surface. But not yet, not until she knew exactly whose hands were steady enough to hold it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The scarred instructor knelt on the dirt, one hand at his jaw, eyes unfocused from the blow he hadn't seen coming. The two others groaned where they'd fallen, trying to pull air back into their lungs. The young recruit stared as if the world had tilted sideways. A woman, a thin farmer's daughter, standing while three trained men lay scattered at her feet. Rage tried to drag the scarred man upright. Pride is stubborn even with pain screaming through bone. He pushed himself up, muscles straining, face twisted with a mix of disgrace and hatred. He lunged again, more animal than soldier now, fingers clawing for her throat, for something to crush so he could restore the order he understood. Strong above, weak below. Eleanor had seen that look before, on the face of an English officer when a poor miller dared to complain about taxes, on the face of a noble when a colonist refused to step off the road fast enough. It was the fury of a man raised to believe that his will was law, and any resistance a personal insult. She didn't retreat. As he charged, she stepped sideways, letting his momentum drag him past her. Her hand cut up under his arm, fingers hooking the joint, shoulder turning with ruthless precision. In one swift movement, she twisted and dropped her weight, dragging him down and locking his arm behind his back. His body slammed into the packed earth with a crack of impact that echoed through the hut. Straw jumped. Dust drifted. He roared, but the sound broke into a strangled gasp when she shifted the hold and pinned him more brutally. Her knee dug into the muscles between his shoulder blades. One hand locked his wrist at an angle that promised real damage if he fought. The other pressed the back of his neck into the ground, fingers hard against his skull. It had taken seconds. He tried to buck her off. His boots scrabbled for purchase, heels grooving the dirt, but she rode the movement, shifting her center of gravity with practiced ease. The more he thrashed, the deeper the pain bit. Sweat sprang across his brow. His breath turned ragged, frantic. "Stop!" she said, voice low but carrying. "Stop, or you lose the use of this arm." He froze, not from obedience, but from the sharp, undeniable calculation of someone suddenly realizing his body was no longer his own. One wrong move, and the limb that had held a musket, thrown men to the ground, and pointed the way during drills, would hang useless at his side. The recruits stared, mouths parted, eyes wide. These were sons of blacksmiths, cobblers, smallholders. They had grown up watching their fathers bow after being slapped by English merchants, watching elders humiliated by arrogant officers who never feared consequence. They knew what it was to see power used as a whip. They had never seen it reversed so cleanly, so efficiently, by someone the world insisted was lesser. The chief instructor stepped closer, boots grinding the dirt. He looked down at the immobilized man, then at Eleanor, who held the lock without shaking, despite the bruises along her ribs and the rawness in her shoulders. "Release him," the chief ordered. Eleanor tightened her grip for a fraction of a second, more warning than defiance, then slowly eased the pressure without letting the man stand. The scarred instructor drew in a shuddering breath of relief. His cheeks burned red with degradation. The humiliation was worse than the pain. Being held down in front of the recruits, forced into stillness by the very person he had treated as lesser than a recruit, tore at whatever pride he had left. "You attacked me twice," she said, not looking away from the chief. "Once in darkness, once just now, when your back was turned. I defended myself. If this is a camp of patriots, not an English garrison, then that should matter." The chief regarded her in silence. His gaze flicked to the recruits, to the other instructors, to the bruise darkening along her jaw, to the faint tremor in her arms, where she still channeled pain into control. He saw more than a scuffle. He saw the line being drawn between old habits of domination and the new spirit they claimed to be forging. "Get up," he said finally. Eleanor shifted, releasing the lock and stepping aside. The scarred man rolled onto his side, face twisted with fury, clutching his arm as if it had been branded. He forced himself to his feet, jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. Shame clung to him like a second skin. He could not meet the recruit's eyes. "This is what happens when you underestimate those you claim to fight alongside," the chief said, his voice cutting through the thick air. "We fight for a people the Empire calls weak, poor, ignorant. Replace that empire and keep its arrogance, and what have we gained? A new flag over the same chains." One of the younger recruits swallowed, gaze flicking from the chief to Eleanor. "Sir," he blurted, half afraid of his own words. She moved like someone trained, not just a farm girl. Murmurs rose, nods, quiet, affirmations. They had all seen it. No one could deny it now. Eleanor felt the weight of their attention settle on her like fresh armor, heavy but necessary. With each pair of eyes, the risk grew. The more they suspected, the more questions would follow. About where she had learned such techniques, about who had taught her, about what exactly she was before she crossed into this place, carrying a hidden emblem that could not be allowed to fall into careless hands. The chief turned back to her. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked. She hesitated. The medallion felt like a burning coal against her skin, even though it lay hidden under wool and linen. This was the crossroads she'd been walking toward since the moment she stepped into the camp. To speak was to reveal the path that had led her here, the clandestine lessons behind shuttered windows, the messages carried across town lines under clouds and rain, the silent oaths taken in crowded rooms where no one dared speak the word liberty too loud for fear of informers. "In places where colonists are not allowed to raise their voices," she replied carefully. "In alleys where English officers don't bother to look down. Among people who have no guns but still know how to survive." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't enough. The chief heard the gaps between her words. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion meant to crush her, but in the sharper scrutiny of a man who understood too well that rebellion attracted more than simple farmers with simple dreams. "Your story is thinner than your coat," he said quietly. "One day you will have to decide whether to wear it proudly or tear it open." A shadow of silence passed through the hut. The scarred instructor flinched at the rebuke, but the wound in his pride was too deep to heal with one reprimand. His glare slid toward Eleanor like a promise. There was betrayal budding in that look, not just against her, but perhaps against the very cause he claimed to serve. Men, like him, humiliated in front of those they considered beneath them, often sought to restore their importance in darker places. Eleanor saw it. She had seen it before, in lesser forms, in small taverns where a slighted merchant later whispered to an English officer about which colonists spoke too freely after too much ale. Shame could turn into venom. Venom needed a target. The young recruits broke into scattered murmurs. Some watched her with something like awe, others with unease, as if the ground beneath their old certainties had shifted. A woman who fought like that, a peasant who knew more than she revealed. Their understanding of who could carry the weight of this uprising was beginning to change, whether they wanted it to or not. The chief raised his voice. "Enough gawking. Back to positions. The enemy won't pause because your world feels strange." They obeyed, though the usual clumsiness of early drills now moved under a new tension. Muskets rose and dropped. Orders snapped. Through the air, the smell of powder grew thick, but beneath it all, something quieter stirred. A realization that this fight was no longer simply about men with rifles standing in lines. It was about every soul that had been told to kneel and had finally learned to stand. Eleanor stepped aside, pressing her back briefly against a wooden post, letting the pounding in her chest slow. Her ribs hurt with each breath, but there was a different ache now too, a sharp awareness that time was shrinking, that she could not keep the truth buried forever. Because beyond the tree line, beyond the muddy yard and rough cabins, English generals were not sleeping. Wealthy merchants were not resting. They were planning, mapping roads, counting the number of guns in colonies they called ungrateful. They spoke of subduing rebellion, the way hunters speak of beating a snared animal until it stops moving. And the letters she had carried, the conversations she had overheard, the names burned into her. Memory. All of it hinted at a coming blow aimed precisely at places like this camp. A trap dressed as negotiation. A promise of mercy hiding the blade of annihilation. She watched the scarred instructor stalk to the edge of the hut, shoulders stiff, jaw set. He did not look at her again, but she felt his hatred like a draft under the door. If such a man were offered a chance to wound her in return, or to regain his standing by trading secrets to the wrong ears, would he hesitate? The question pressed hard against her already bruised ribs. As another volley rattled through the barn, shaking dust from the beams, Eleanor adjusted her grip on the musket and lifted her head. The journey that brought her here was almost done hiding in shadows. Soon, the struggle would demand that she step fully into the fire, with all the revelations, risks, and irreversible decisions that would set not only her fate, but perhaps that of every poor farmer, every aging militiaman, every frightened child, whose future depended on whether this rebellion would truly lead to dignity, or be strangled before it could learn to breathe. They arrived 3 days later, when the cold had settled into the camp like a second skin, and the bruises on Eleanor's body had begun to turn yellow at the edges. No warning, no horn, just the sudden crunch of unfamiliar boots on frozen mud, and the low murmur spreading from mouth to mouth. Supervisors, riders, men from higher up in the rebellion, they wore no polished coats, no noble crests, yet everything in their bearing said authority. Their cloaks were travel-stained, their faces lined, their eyes sharp in a way that came from watching too many burials carried out behind barns and in shallow forest graves. These were not dreamers, they were men who had counted the cost of resistance in torn bodies and weeping mothers. The camp stiffened. The scarred instructor straightened his shoulders, as if trying to shrug off the memory of being pressed into the dirt. The other officers scrambled to look disciplined. Recruits rushed to line up, muskets clutched nervously, boots not quite in unison. Poor farmers, cobblers, carpenters, all trying to look like a real army for men who had seen real war. Eleanor watched from her place in the ranks, heart beating slowly, evenly. This was the kind of visit that could either cleanse or rot a place like this. The lead supervisor dismounted with a grunt, handing his reins to a young militiaman whose hands shook slightly under the animal's weight. The newcomer's hair was mostly grey, but his movements carried a dangerous energy. His gaze swept the camp, lingering on the worn cabins, the poorly stacked firewood, the crude infirmary hut. Then he looked at the men, at the bruises that didn't match training drills, at the tired, hollowed faces of boys who had seen too much discipline and too little respect. "Commander Hale," the chief instructor said, stepping forward. So now the camp had a name to whisper in fear, or hope. "Welcome to the Northern Training Post. We weren't expecting. You weren't meant to," Hale cut in. His voice was rough, not unkind, but unforgiving. "Reports reached us. Accidents, lost recruits, training incidents. A boy shot in the leg by a misfire. Another crippled by a fall from the watchtower with no witnesses. We came to see how you are preparing men to stand for independence, and why so many of them never make it that far." A tightness moved through the assembled officers. The scarred instructor flinched almost imperceptibly. His jaw still bore a faint swelling beneath the skin. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This was it, the deeper rot creeping into the open. The inspection began like any other. Lines checked, muskets examined, drills observed. Yet Hale's questions cut deeper than form. Who trained you? How many have you lost? Under what circumstances? He did not accept vague answers. When an officer mumbled something about unfortunate accidents, Hale's eyes hardened. "Accidents," he repeated. "Always convenient, that word. It hides more betrayal than open treason." Later, inside the galpone, where the air still smelled of powder and old straw, the supervisors gathered the instructors and several recruits for questioning. Eleanor was pulled in with them, almost as an afterthought, yet she felt the deliberate weight of that choice. Someone had noticed more than they admitted. They began with records. Tattered. Lists. Names crossed out with brief notes. Illness, misstep, training mishap. Hale listened, expression unreadable, then called for the men whose lives brushed those notes. A bent-backed farmer spoke of his cousin, a quiet boy who had dared to question an order and afterward fell during a night drill. A young miller's son described being forced to run drills until his feet bled for not reloading quickly enough. An older man, his beard streaked with white, told how his grandson had been left with a shattered arm after a demonstration that sounded too much like the one Eleanor knew all too well. Their voices shook, but they did not lie. These were people who had already endured humiliation from English officers and wealthy colonials who treated them as tools. They had joined the rebellion searching for dignity, finding the same contempt under a different banner cut deep. The scarred instructor tried to defend himself. He talked about harsh realities, about how the British would not spare them because they were poor, about how liberty demanded sacrifice. "We cannot coddle them," he insisted. "If they break here, they would break faster under enemy fire." Hale let him speak, then gestured toward the recruits. "And how many of these men did you already decide would break?" he asked. "How many did you write off, the way the Empire has written off our entire people? You were given authority to shape patriots, not to imitate the arrogance of those who call us animals." The chief instructor shifted, guilt flickering beneath his stern demeanor. He had allowed this, maybe not with delight, but with silence. Silence, Eleanor knew, could be its own kind of betrayal. When the questioning reached her, the hut seemed to lean closer. Hale's eyes landed on the faint bruise at her jaw, the way she held herself carefully, the steady fire in her gaze. "You're not here by mistake," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Eleanor replied. "Mistakes are for people who have choices." "Name?" "Eleanor Briggs." "Where from?" "A farm near the river towns, taxed half to death, like most." A faint, humorless smile tugged at one corner of Hale's mouth. "That describes 3/4 of this camp." His gaze sharpened. "I've heard you fought back, that you handled 3 trained men in seconds. Who taught you that?" "Eleanor Briggs from the river towns." The hidden medallion seemed to burn against her skin. The journey that had carried her from whispered meetings in back rooms to this barn full of shaking recruits pressed against her tongue. She could feel the weight of revelation hanging in the air, one decision away from tumbling out. "I learned," she said slowly, "from people who got tired of watching elders beaten in the street, from men who saw their wives searched like thieves by redcoats, from women who watched English nobles drag their sons into service and decided they would not lose another child without leaving scars." Hale studied her. For a brief moment, his eyes dropped to the spot beneath her collar where the outline of the medallion might show if the fabric pulled tight. The committee's quiet symbol, the clandestine seal that bound messengers and watchers across the colonies. "I've seen that look before," he murmured, "on those who carry more than they say." The scarred instructor seized the chance to strike. "She's hiding something," he snapped. "She arrived alone, no papers, no escort, and she fights like a hired knife. For all we know, she could be a spy sent by the British themselves. They use women too, you know. Pretty faces, innocent stories." The accusation was a slap thrown in desperation, a last attempt to divert the blow of judgment away from his own failures. Still, the word spy cast a long shadow. Recruits shifted. Suspicion and fear moved through them like a cold wind. Eleanor did not flinch. She had heard worse from English mouths. "If I worked for the Crown," she said, "I wouldn't need to stand in your barn getting kicked into the floor. I'd just wait for you to keep killing your own in the name of training until there was no rebellion left." Hale's gaze flicked sharply toward the scarred man. "Interesting," he said. "She points out what our enemies hope for, that we destroy ourselves before they need to." He turned back to Eleanor. "Yet he is not wrong. You are hiding something. The question is whether that secret serves our struggle for independence or threatens it." The silence inside the hut thickened. Even the wind outside seemed to hush. Eleanor felt her heart hammering against the small disc under her clothes. The hidden truth she carried had reached the edge of its hiding place. "The English are planning to gather certain leaders," she said, the decision tearing itself free. "They speak of peace, talks, a chance to restore order without unnecessary bloodshed. It's a lie, a trap. I've heard the details from lips too drunk to realize they were confessing treachery. There are names, routes, times. I did not come here just to learn to shoot. I came to see whether this camp was worth saving, and whether its leaders could be trusted to carry what I know without selling it for their own pride." Hale's face hardened, not in anger at her, but in grim recognition of the stakes. Betrayal, sacrifice, decisions that could not be undone. Behind him, the chief instructor lowered his eyes, as if finally grasping the full measure of what had been allowed to fester under his command. The scarred man's expression twisted, shame and fury warring in his features as his own degradation became a footnote beside the revelation of a greater danger. Young recruits looked from Eleanor to their superiors, seeing for the first time how thin the wall was between their fragile hope for liberty and the abyss that waited if that hope was mishandled. Their journey had seemed simple: learn to fight, face the redcoats, win freedom. Now they tasted a darker truth. That rebellion also meant rooting out rot among their own, choosing leaders who would not trade their dignity for control, listening to voices they had been taught to ignore. Hale stepped closer to Eleanor, his shadow falling across her boots. "Then you and I," he said quietly, "are going to talk, and this camp is going to change, or it will be torn apart before the enemy ever fires a shot." The words settled over everyone like a verdict not yet written. Outside, the pale sun struggled through low clouds, throwing a weak light over the cabins, the muddy yard, the men whose lives were now entwined with secrets larger than any one of them. Eleanor felt the chill reach her bones, but beneath it something else stirred, a fragile sense that her long journey through degradation and silence might finally be turning toward the confrontation she had been sent here to force, whether anyone liked it or not. Eleanor did not sleep the night the investigation ended. The camp held its breath under a sky of restless clouds, waiting for the verdict that would determine whether this place became a cradle of independence or another graveyard built by arrogance. Fires burned low. Men whispered, some prayed. Others simply sat with their hands clasped, staring at the darkness beyond the tree line, imagining red coats advancing with torches and chains. The fear was real, but so was the flicker of something deeper, an awakening they had not expected, ignited by a woman they once dismissed as fragile. At dawn, Commander Hale gathered the entire camp. No barked orders, no forced formation, just a quiet summons that pulled every recruit, every instructor, every trembling farm boy and limping militiaman into the open yard. Eleanor stood among them, bruises fading, resolve sharpened to steel. The scarred instructor lingered at the back, shadowed by accusations and the weight of his own disgrace. The chief instructor stood straighter than usual, chastened but transformed, as if the truth had cut away layers of complacency. Hale's voice rose over the frosted morning air. He spoke of betrayal disguised as leadership, of accidents that were not accidents, of egos that had endangered the cause more than any British regiment. He did not shout. He didn't need to. His words carried the force of a hammer striking iron. "We fight an empire that sees us as animals," he said. "If we treat each other with the same contempt, then we deserve the chains they forge for us." Shame thickened the silence. Men stared at their boots. Others met Eleanor's eyes with a mixture of regret and newfound respect. It was not comfort she sought from them. It was accountability, and slowly, painfully, it took root. Then Hale announced the decision that would reshape the camp. "From this day forward," he declared, "Eleanor Briggs is an appointed instructor of this company, not for revenge, not for pride, but because she understands something too many have forgotten, that liberty begins with dignity, discipline without cruelty, strength without corruption, and courage without the poison of domination." A stir moved through the crowd. Surprise, doubt, awe, even fear, because a woman stepping into a role reserved for hardened men pressed against the old boundaries they still carried in their bones. But Hale continued, "She will oversee close-quarters training, tactical discipline, and the safety of new recruits. Anyone who cannot accept her authority does not belong in a force that calls itself patriotic." The scarred instructor looked as if the earth had tilted under his feet. But there was no rage left in him, only a hollow understanding that the cause he claimed to serve had finally risen above his pride. He lowered his eyes. It was the closest thing to surrender a man like him could offer. Eleanor stepped forward, every bruise on her body a quiet testament to the journey that had brought her here, through shame, through fear, through the kind of degradation meant to silence a soul. But her voice carried with quiet fire. "I don't ask for your loyalty," she said. "I ask for your honesty. Fight with truth. Fight with honor. Fight so that our children do not inherit a world ruled by men who think themselves gods. If we want independence, we must deserve it. We must bleed for it with purpose, not with cruelty." Heads lifted, not in defiance but in fragile unity. the kind that blooms when people realize they are being led by someone who would rather break than betray them. Training changed after that. The air no longer tasted of fear. Recruits stumbled, struggled, failed, but they were guided, not crushed. Eleanor walked among them with firm steps, correcting a stance here, adjusting a grip there, pushing them harder than before, but never with contempt. She demanded sacrifice, but not shame. She forged strength, but not domination. And slowly, as days folded into weeks, the camp became something worthy of the rebellion's hopes. The young saw in her a living defiance of the Empire's arrogance. The old found in her a spark they thought long extinguished. Even the chief instructor learned to stand beside her instead of above her, humbled by the revelation that leadership was not a privilege. It was a burden carried only by those willing to protect the weakest under their command. Rumors spread beyond the camp, not of scandal, but of a transformation, of a silent arrival that had become a turning point, of a woman who carried a hidden truth and reshaped a company of frightened farmers into a disciplined band of patriots. Some called her a flame, others a storm, but all agreed she was proof that liberty's guardians came in many forms, unpredictable, unbreakable, and forged in the dark places where oppression tried to bury them. As winter crept in, and the first distant tremors of British movement reached their ears, the men no longer looked at the horizon with despair. They looked with determination, with the stubborn hope that demands blood, sacrifice, and unshakable discipline. And every time Eleanor watched them line up at dawn, muskets shining in the pale light, she felt the quiet truth settle deep in her bones. The journey was only beginning. Harder trials lay ahead. Betrayal still lingered in the shadows. The hidden threat she carried would soon require action that might cost her more than wounds or reputation, but she would face it. For them, for the nameless farmers crushed by taxes, for the children torn from their homes, for every insult, every disgrace, every wound carved into her people by an empire drunk on its own supremacy. For independence, not as a dream, but as a birthright reclaimed. Because liberty, true liberty, does not bloom in comfort. It rises from sacrifice. If you felt this story burn in your chest, if Eleanor's struggle stirred something in you, let me know. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and support the channel so we can keep bringing these stories of courage, dignity, and rebellion to life.